Hello, my name is Thomas Germano. I'll be presenting this evening on Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo's monumental work was begun in 1508, finished 4 years later on the 31st of October in 1512, and then it would be another 24 years until Michelangelo returns to the Sistine Chapel to paint the Last Judgment, the altarpiece, from 1536 to 1541. There'll be two parts to this presentation. The first part will be the ceiling by Michelangelo, and the second lecture will be all about the Last Judgment. So please join me, and we'll enter into the Sistine Chapel, and I'm going to take you on a virtual tour of first the ceiling, and the second part of today's presentation will be the Last Judgment altarpiece. So let's see how we can do this now. Here we are now in the Cappella di Sistina, the chapel known as the Sistine, named after the person who commissioned it in the 1480s, Pope Sixtus IV. And Sixtus IV was from the Della Rovere family. He is the uncle of the man who would commission Michelangelo to paint the ceiling some quarter of a century later. Sixtus IV had the Sistine Chapel designed based on the Temple of Solomon from ancient Jerusalem. Some 3,000 years ago, Solomon built a temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem that was later destroyed by the Assyrians, Neo-Babylonians, and rebuilt and destroyed by the Romans in the first century. So recreating that Jerusalem Temple of Solomon within the walls of Vatican City, this is the Pope's private chapel. And Michelangelo came on the scene long after the chapel was completed and long after the side walls were painted by the likes of Botticelli, Perugino, Pinturicchio, Cosimo Rosselli, and Michelangelo's own teacher, Domenico Ghirlandaio. So those are the paintings on the side walls that you see on the right and on the left, halfway between the ceiling and the floor. They represent scenes from the life of Jesus on one side and scenes from the life of Moses on the opposite side. Both Sixtus and Julius, uncle and nephew, two popes 25 years apart, saw themselves as Christian equivalents of Moses, the leader of the people to the promised land. So let's enter into the chapel and talk about what Michelangelo would do from 1508 to 1512. He came to the chapel, and the chapel had already been decorated with a barrel vaulted ceiling painted blue with gold stars. And Michelangelo would paint over that using fresco, which is wet plaster. And while the plaster is still wet, he would put a water-based paint, and that's what you're looking at 500 plus years after it was completed, still in remarkable condition, with only minor areas that needed restoration. The ceiling begins on this end in the book of Genesis, where God creates the world in 7 days, and it ends just at the top of your screen, where we find the great flood, the drunkenness of Noah, and the end of the 9 panels that tell the story from the book of Genesis. So to make sense out of this enormous, very complex composition on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, I'm going to break it down into 4 digestible zones. The first zone is what you see down the center of the barrel vaulted ceiling, and these are 9 scenes taken directly from the book of Genesis. It's the creation of the world, the creation of man, the creation of woman, the fall of man and woman, and then we see the sacrifice, the great deluge, and the drunkenness of Noah. saved by the ark that God told him to build, saving two of each species. So those are the 9 scenes down the center. In short, it's the creation of the world and humans and the destruction and salvation of the world. There are 9 panels, and the alternating panels, the first, third, fifth, seventh, and ninth, are flanked by classical nude figures, and we call those ignudi. And Michelangelo uses those classical male forms as framing devices. That's the first zone. The second zone introduces the largest figures on the ceiling just outside that central zone in the middle of the barrel vaulted ceiling. These are prophets and sibyls, and they both serve the same role. They foretell the coming of the Messiah. They're prophets who tell us about the future. So we recognize the females as pagan seers into the future, and we recognize the male forms on the left here as the Old Testament Hebrew prophets. The third zone are these triangular cutaways called pendentives and the half circles, which we'll call lunettes, a half moon shape. Those are the only vertical parts of the ceiling painted by Michelangelo, and those images all represent the genealogy of Jesus Christ. It's the family tree that traces from Jesse's tree through King David, King Solomon, right down to Jesus and his parents. The fourth and the final zone brings us into the corner of the chapel. And there are 4 corners. We see them here, just over the altar, and here. And those represent the 4 divine interventions when God saves the chosen people, the Jewish people, from complete annihilation. On the far end, we see the punishment of Haman, and we see the brazen serpent. And just at the top of your screen, in the corners, which we call the spandrels, we see Judith, who has just beheaded Holofernes on the right, and on the upper left, David beheading Goliath, a theme that Michelangelo had just sculpted 4 years before he started the Sistine ceiling in 1508. Now, coming in a little bit closer, we're going to see that Michelangelo did an about-face. In the midst of this project, he learned something that made it better and easier to read from 60 feet below the surface of the paintings. There are too many figures up here to make heads or tails by the naked eye, and without the aid of digital technology and cameras that have zooms on the end, and what you're going to see me doing zooming in, it's very difficult to read what's happening on this side, these last 3 panels, which get very crowded and busy with lots of figures. They also look like they're composed as if they're vertical wall paintings. Michelangelo learned something as he's working from this end, working against the chronological order of the reading I'm about to give you, and what he learns is to put fewer figures down here and also have a little bit more breaking of the picture plane. So there's an interaction between the figures in the composition and the viewer's world down below. God comes out of the space. This figure of Jonas penetrates that curving vaulting of the architecture itself. And one of the most incredible figures in the history of art, this projected form of Haman, who is crucified to an old gnarly tree whose arm is coming out literally into the space of the viewer and off the ceiling. So that didn't exist where Michelangelo began the painting up on this end, but he finished and had learned a few tricks along the way. So let's start in a chronological reading of the painting, if we will. And we're going to see from this side, as we zoom in a little bit closer, that Michelangelo has painted scenes from the book of Genesis. The first one is God separating light from darkness, flanked by 4 ignudi that frame this. And the ignudi as you can see when we get a little bit closer, the ignudi are carrying bundles of acorns, oak leaves, and this is from the family coat of arms of the Della Rovere, from which Julius II was from that family, as was his uncle Sixtus IV, whom the chapel is named after. So that's God separating the light from darkness. The second panel, just above it, shows God creating the plants on the left, and he's ordering, as we see him twice within this open panel, no ignudi in the corners, he's ordering the sun and the moon and the planets into their heavenly bodies, into their orbits. The third scene shows God separating the water from the land. And then the most famous image, the fourth scene, shows the creation of Adam. And underneath the left arm of God, who's outstretching his right arm as he's creating Adam out of this mound of earth, we see the yet to be created Eve, who comes in the next scene. There's also the shape that surrounds God's red cape, which we see him wearing in the previous three scenes, and he appears twice in the second scene. That red cape that's blowing as he's coming down to create Adam appears to be in the shape of a brain, because what differentiates Adam from all of the other creations by God is that he instills in man the capacity to think. In the next scene, which is framed by the ignudi, we see God, who's standing on the earth, commanding Eve to step out of Adam's ribcage. Adam is in a deep slumber, and as he sleeps, Eve is commanded by God to come out of the rib of Adam. In the next scene, it's trouble in paradise, where here Adam and Eve are equally complicit in the first original sin, tempted by the devil, who appears half human on the top and snake-like as that serpentine tail is wrapped around the tree that divides the composition into two equal halves. The left is the original sin, temptation, eating from the tree of knowledge, and the right side shows Adam and Eve aware of digression and their sin and being expelled from the Garden of Paradise. There's more than just the sin of eating an apple, and the positioning of both Adam and Eve suggests a taboo sexual act. You can use your imagination for the rest. In the next scene, there's a sacrifice taking place, and there's an old bearded figure and an older woman. There's two thoughts as to who exactly is doing the sacrificing. Some will contest that this is Adam and Eve atoning for their earlier sins and their sons who are giving to God the fruits of their labor, the animal of one son and the agrarian of the other son. But there is a sacrifice. Other art historians and theologians believe that this is not Adam and Eve, but rather the one family that gets spared in the great flood, which is the scene to follow. So that would make it Noah and his family doing the sacrificing, because Noah was the only person spared. In the next scene, which we'll come to, which represents one of the only times that Michelangelo paints a full-fledged landscape, and this is the deluge, the great flood. And the great flood shows Noah and his family on that floating device in the background, and all the wicked behavior of humanity trying to come to higher ground, some even so ignorant to bring their worldly possessions, but all will perish in the end. And Michelangelo represents a very busy scene of the destruction of the world and all of the wicked within it. Now, we're going to bypass this little damaged section, which happened as a result of a mortar explosion that took place outside of the chapel. There was a canister that landed on the outside roof of the Sistine chapel, and that dislodged the paint many years after the death of Michelangelo, and that's why this section just on the upper right of the screen is damaged. So we're going to go around that and look at the last scene now, which is the drunkenness of Noah. And as I flip around here and get a little bit closer to that last scene, we're going to see Noah, who's been on the ark for 40 days with his family. The man needs a drink, and he's in this drunken state. His sons discover him. They are a little bit embarrassed for their father because he's in a state of drunken stupor and naked. You see in the background the ark, which he's been on for many, many, many days, 40 days and 40 nights. So his sons, who have discovered the old man, cover him up and make him decent. And this is the damage section on the upper right here, which I mentioned was caused as a result of that gunpowder fireworks explosion outside the chapel. In red, that is Noah burying the bones of Adam that we see upside down on the right side of the screen as it appears right now. And we're going to stay in this orientation because the next figure that I want to point out is directly underneath that scene of the drunkenness of Noah, the ninth of 9 scenes from the book of Genesis. And this brings us to the prophet Zechariah. The name is underneath, and then just underneath the name is the family coat of arms of the Della Rovere. That's the acorn and the oak tree, and the papal tiara and keys of St. Peter. We believe this is one of the rare occasions that Michelangelo did a portrait, and in this case, it's the bearded Pope Julius II. Julius was one of the rare popes who actually wore facial hair, and it was a white beard, which is represented on the prophet Zechariah. And the name Zechariah in Hebrew translates to he who is mindful of the Lord. This is the figure that the priest standing on the altar looking across the entire chapel will see as he raises the host up high. He looks across the chapel, and that's the focal point that he looks at. Julius looking at himself across the chapel. And every subsequent pope who celebrated Mass there looks at the portrait of Zechariah, who is Julius II, the patron of Michelangelo. On either side of the Sistine ceiling's 9 panels, we have prophets and sibyls. There's Joel on this side, and as we come down a little bit further, you'll see a number of female sibyls and male prophets who all foretell the future. They are represented with scrolls and books and writing instruments because they record things that have yet to be fulfilled. They have a vision into the future. And there are some wonderful representations on the ceiling on either side of the center panel, but these represent the second of 4 zones. Now, while we're in this orientation, I'd also like to point out some of the things that Michelangelo did when he started in 1508. He moved across the ceiling, working from one side to the other side, and then all the way across in the order opposite of how I just explained the 9 panels from the book of Genesis. So this would have been one of the earlier works. It's David beheading Goliath. A very huge success in the Piazza Signoria in Firenze. Michelangelo's sculpture of 13.5 feet was very well received, and just 4 years later, he goes to Rome and does the same subject of David, but this time in the act of decapitating the fallen giant of the Philistine army, Goliath. And that's one of the 4 spandrels, the divine intervention on the part of God to save the chosen people, the Jews. Then we have the genealogy in this pendentive and the lunette, and the one thing in common is that we'll see babies and their parents, and there's a plaque in between the parents that represents the different family lineage. Okay, there's another baby in the arms of a mother and the father, and the plaque identifying each one of them, just as the plaques underneath the largest figures on the ceiling, the prophets and the sibyls, identify who they are. Okay, we're going to move now to a long view and look at where Michelangelo finished the ceiling, these are the figures that he painted 4 years after the ones we were just looking at. And you'll see so much more spatial dimension in the figure of Jonah and the large fish, in the figure of Jeremiah, who broods and thinks. He's the influence for Auguste Rodin's Thinker, sculpted by the great French sculptor in the 19th century, but based on Michelangelo's invention of this brooding, thinking prophet. Right over here to the left of Jonah. And to the right of Jonah is the famous Libyan Sibyl. So we'll take a closer look at both of those in a moment as we come across the room and up to the altar section and take a closer look at what we have on this end. As we come right up onto the altar and go straight up, this is where Michelangelo truly shows his genius and where the project finishes, where the story of Genesis begins, the separation of light and darkness, where God has an interactive spatial capacity. In the Libyan Sibyl, who twists and turns in such an animated pose as she's reaching for the book on the shelf behind her. And this wonderful figure of Jonah and the whale that swallowed him and brought him to where God wanted him to prophesize in a place he didn't want to go, and he got on a boat, and God made sure that that boat was not going to take him away from where God wanted him to be. So the captain of the boat threw Jonah overboard at his own confession that it was he that was causing this near fatal storm. He was thrown overboard. The large fish swallowed him, and he would later be brought to the shores of where God wanted him. So you see the fish to the right of the left leg of Jonah, and we also see Jonah's legs that defy architectural space. Think of that as a vaulted ceiling. So Michelangelo redefines the vaulting of the ceiling, bringing those two knees and the feet, which is actually further back in space than the area on the top, which he inverts by foreshortening and throwing that upper torso and head back in space. And then he tilts the axis of the head itself so that we see the underside of the neck. This is a brilliant demonstration of Michelangelo's mastery of human anatomy, and that's where Michelangelo finished the project closer to 1512, shortly before the unveiling of the Sistine Chapel. Now we come to the spandrel on this side, which is the brazen serpent. All those who were following Moses grew impatient with his being lost in the desert for 40 years, so they didn't want to follow him anymore. And Moses was instructed by God to put his staff into the ground and it would turn into a brazen serpent, because all of the people following Moses had been set upon by a terrible malady. Snakes bit them all, and they were going to die if they had no faith. This was the test of their faith, and it was a weeding out of the faithless. Those who had no confidence in Moses did not look upon the brazen serpent with their wounds, and they perished. Those who had faith in Moses, that he was a man of God, held their wounds to that brazen serpent, which we see just in the center of the composition, as they hold out their wounded snake bites, and they heal miraculously by that transformed brazen serpent staff of Moses. On the other side, we see the punishment of Haman. And this is one of the rare occasions where Michelangelo uses architecture to separate the composition from the right half and the left half. The architecture divides the bedchambers of the Persian king who orders his advisor Haman to be punished and put to death. Haman is the namesake for that wonderful cookie that's served around Purim in the Jewish holiday. It's the three-sided cookie, the triangular-shaped cookie, which is modeled after the hat of Haman, and Jews call that Hamantaschen today. It comes in apricot and sometimes poppy seed and other flavors, but a wonderful foodstuff for the holidays around Purim. That's in the beginning of the spring. So there's a wall that separates the bedchamber of King Ahasuerus, the Persian king, who orders the punishment of Haman. he did not crucify Haman, but Michelangelo takes artistic license and has him attached to this gnarly old tree. And look at how the left arm of Haman comes right out of the space. There's an interactive foreshortening of that limb, and the left leg goes back into space at the foot and forward at the knee. It's a brilliant demonstration of Michelangelo's anatomical virtuosity right here in this conclusion of the ceiling, and a hint of some of the greatest things that Michelangelo is about to do in his lengthy career. By 1512, when Michelangelo finished this project, he was only 37 years old, and he had many years ahead of him and many great works to follow. Now, to the left of that figure of the punishment of Haman, whose illusion is so much more convincing because of the architecture that's penetrated by that yellow-shirted figure that comes through the doorway, in that liminal space, he sets up the believability of the left arm of Haman coming right out of the picture plane and into the viewer's space down below. So without that figure and without that architecture, the illusion of projected anatomy would be a little bit less convincing. And Michelangelo did an amazing job as a true master of anatomy, and in a rare occasion here, perspective and architecture as well, demonstrating that he could do perspective with the best of the Renaissance masters. He learned from one of the best, Domenico Ghirlandaio, who was his teacher in fresco painting back in Florence. Now we come to that brooding thinker of Jeremiah, who I pointed out from across the room, and he's thinking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the enslavement of his fellow Jews. A terrible piece of information that he has to share by a form of a curse that's weight on his shoulders, and he is weighted down by that horrible news, thinking of how he might share that and the ramifications of what it means: the destruction of the beloved city of Jerusalem, the destruction of the Temple of Solomon, and the enslavement of the Jewish people for the next 50 years. A terrible piece of news that makes him brooding, melancholic, and moody as we see him down below, about to tell that story to the fellow people of Jerusalem. Okay, as we come to some of the details across the ceiling and wrapping this up, those are the four zones that were just outlined. Coming back across the ceiling, those are the scenes from the book of Genesis, the largest figures, prophets and sibyls, the corners, which is the divine intervention, and the spandrels, which represent the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And this is a very comical character right over here on the bottom left. He's a man who's very pugnacious, and he looks at the staff that has a figure with a beard pointed out in his direction, making a funny face at him as he's about to get into a fight with his own cap and decorative top of his walking stick. He's a very ornery character who's on the right, as his wife and child are to the left of that plaque. Okay, many figures throughout the ceiling, but one thing the naked eye has a very difficult time in determining is that these are not ledges. They're illusions of architectonic forms that come out in space, and Michelangelo paints the architecture to look like sculpture attached to ledges and blocks that are all part of the scheme of that smooth barrel vaulted ceiling. So it's an act of virtuosity and one of the greatest masterpieces of Western art. And here, as we get another view down the long way towards the end where we began with Zechariah right here, these are the spandrels that include David and Goliath. And the last of the spandrels I haven't shown you in detail, that's the story of Judith with the decapitated head of Holofernes as she escaped from his tent with the Assyrian general's head on a tray. A few details as we close out the first half of this lecture before getting to the second half and looking at the Last Judgment in detail. We'll look up from the center at the majesty and the beauty of Michelangelo's great masterpiece in the Sistine Chapel. So please join me for the next part of Michelangelo's work done 24 years later, which we'll get to in part 2 of this presentation. Thank you so much for your attention today.